let me ask you something. Do you feel like cemeteries are likely places to be haunted?
No, Nick, I do not.
Tell me what your reasoning is for that.
So I feel like cemeteries. I'm gonna like walk this back probably at some point, but to specifically answer your question, I don't feel like cemeteries are typically great places to be haunted in the sense of active ghosts roaming them, because nothing really tragic happens there. They're usually relatively peaceful places. Now, there's definitely sadness at cemeteries, but there usually isn't like tragedies happening. And a lot of times we associate hauntings with either tragic things happening or people spending a lot of time there with like residual hauntings and things. So I just think, generally speaking, why would a ghost, again, we don't know the mechanisms for these things, but if a ghost was going to haunt somewhere, why would they haunt a cemetery, not a home or where they died or a place of higher emotion?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Again, what are the rules? Well, we have a lot of different rules of hauntings and ghost stories that have been laid out traditionally. And you're right, it's usually associated with where a person died or with specific tragedy, the location of a tragedy, or where somebody spent a lot of time. And cemeteries, by and large, just don't add up. But I wanted to talk today about a very specific cemetery and my and a couple of our friends' story regarding it. And so here's an interesting aspect. What if that cemetery is a personal family plot on family land? How does that affect your thoughts?
You know what? I think that does kind of change things a little bit in the sense that you have a lot of condensed specific family history in one place where it's not just like an amalgamation of people. I think with a family plot, you're more likely to have people coming back to those locations and spending a lot more time because typically family plots are near a family home. So that, I mean, obviously, people do go out and visit their loved ones at regular cemeteries, but I think if you have someone buried in the proverbial backyard, you're going to be spending more time there. So I think that starts to tick that box more often than we said of spending time there. So I mean, I think right off the bat, I think a family plot would maybe be more likely to have some sort of haunting element to it.
Well, let me tell you this story, and I know that you're familiar at least with some snippets of this story, just because, again, this is one around our circle of friends we've been telling for some time. But I don't know if you know the entirety of it, at least how it came to our attention. So let me take us back to about 2002.
What a good year.
Solid year for me personally. Anyhow. 2002, sometime in autumn, I stopped by a friend Corey's house, and he had been talking. He had seen one of these ghost shows in 2002, 2003. That's when a lot of renewed interest in the paranormal and ghosts, and there were a lot of TV shows that started coming out, and it got oversaturated. I know you've heard me complain, like even Animal Planet had like one of those haunted shows that followed the same formula, except that they were really keen to underline that the family had pets, and like that's how they kept it on Animal Planet. Like that was
the justification.
Exactly. It got a bit silly. The market was saturated. So, but anyhow, this was right before all that, but he had been watching some program, and they had been at a cemetery that was fairly close to us. Now, I'm not going to say the name of the cemetery for this evening, only because it is very close to us, one, and has been fairly regularly vandalized because it has a pretty big reputation. So I'm just going to refer to it as Y Cemetery. Okay. But he had been watching a program, and he said, hey, I was watching this thing, and they said this Y Cemetery was the most haunted place they'd ever been to. It was just off the scale, and we need to find out where this is at. And we knew it was by this park. So we would spend some nights driving around trying to find where it was at, talking to people in the area, and getting mixed signals, mixed kind of clues as to where it could be. But eventually, one night, Corey, Brandon, and myself are out in Corey's car. We get onto the road where the cemetery is at. It's a dirt road that goes back a few miles, and I get worked up. Like, I'm just really scared. I am chicken. Like, I really am.
Which that's not you normally don't. That's not like, I don't know. That's rare for you. I feel like when it comes to these kind of things, you're usually one of the more calm folks with these things.
Usually I'd like to think so, but back then I wasn't as much as I am now. I mean, this is going back to better part of 20 years.
That's true.
I was still a teenager, but the bottom line is we get on this road, I get really worked up. I had to like step out of the car and vomit like several times. Like we've worked each other up because
right.
Corey's heard stories from somebody that he works with that, hey, make sure you leave your windows down, because we've heard stories of people going there and getting locked out of their car, or their battery dying. And so now I'm like, I'm really worked up. And
yeah.
These two are not. We're on this dirt road. Because of me being like this, like, they relent, they give in to me, and we go driving off into the night in the direction somewhere else. And that was that for that night. But it was all just as well, because we weren't even on the right road.
Oh, wow.
So a few weeks later, it's now, I guess it's probably a couple months later, it's now early spring, and we're back out there, and it is, I remember it was 60 degrees at night. And because Corey had this Explorer with the temp gauge, and that was a big deal back then.
It was an Eddie Bauer edition Explorer.
That's worth underlining.
I remember that very specifically. It was a wonderful vehicle.
So to get to this place, we go to this park, and there's a road that you turn off to, and there's a few private houses, and you turn off onto a dirt road that goes back a couple miles. It eventually gets back, it connects with a different road that's paved, but you're hugging the side of a lake for a while, and it's pretty out there. We get on the road, and we end up at this cemetery around dusk. And we look at it around. It's pretty cool. It's this big sandstone Walden Cemetery. There's a couple obelisks that stand at the gate. In front of it, a few yards through the trees, there's a lake, and you can't see it, but you know it's there. And immediately outside the lands, there's this hillside. And we sat around looking at it for a little while, and it was spooky. You know, there's a big sandstone gravestone, and the person was born in the 18th century, which is, you know, not super common around here. And he was born in Switzerland. And we get back into the Explorer, and we start driving off because it's getting dark. And, you know, I'm probably worked up, but not as much as the last time. But
still,
you're
still
like 2 miles away.
You're still cautious, yeah.
The weird thing was and you know, car thermometers are not the most accurate of things. I give them like a 5-degree margin of error.
That's being generous, even then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm a generous person. But it sat around 42 degrees. The whole time we were on that paved road, it didn't start warming up again until we got back on the paved road. And then we turned onto a state road from there, just about a quarter mile down. And that's when it finally got back up to just under 60 degrees. So that was kind of a weird thing. When we were there, none of us felt real weird. I mean, it was spooky, but we didn't think anything weird was happening. And of course, I was saying, look, these things are, because even then I am who I am. And I was saying, look, these things are not super accurate. Maybe the cars need to get moving before it would read accurately. I don't know how these thermometers work. Everybody else is very insistent. Like, this is a very weird thing we all just experienced. And It was, but why was it weird? Was it weird because this thing's malfunctioning? Was it weird because something from another realm has made the temperature cooler? I didn't feel like it was 40 some degrees in the car. So interesting. But that was our first time visiting there. And Corey and I would go up again together, and we were walking along the dirt road just in the vicinity, and we saw these hollowed out logs that were clearly part of some sort of irrigation, we figured, that went up that hillside. And I found a cluster gauge from a 30s Ford, it looked like, just sitting there kind of. So we went back a few times, but that was the only time in the day that I was there. And that was just an interesting thing to find these things. And of course, we did some research and we found that the family, the one with the big stone, I said, had been born in Switzerland in the 18th century, so 1700s. He had come over to America as an indentured servant into Philadelphia. He would eventually be a trapper coming out west to western Pennsylvania. And he, through trapping, was able to purchase much of the land that is now this one township in our region. And the family, his sons, would later go on to form the Bar Association here in this county, or be founding members of the Bar Association, lawyers and whatnot. The cemetery itself is on the homestead, and the farm that existed was up on that hill, and probably a ways back. The lake was not there at the time, or if it was like a pond. It was largely expanded upon in the 1970s. And there's actually another cemetery that is some graves are still underwater. So we found all this out about the family, and just it was interesting. It was that historical thing that ties you to a place and gives some humanity to the stones that you see. And I've always been really attracted to that. I think what I've said before is what I don't believe in ghosts. I believe that they've scared me for most of my life, or as paraphrasing the Poe line. But I think that people who are really into ghost stories, to whatever degree or wherever their belief lies, I think that there is a romanticism of history, or
absolutely
they have.
Agreed. Yeah.
Here comes the scariest story, spookiest story. I was, for whatever reason, you may recall back then, I was going through what I call my Rocky IV phase, where I would work all day and I get home and I would just start working out and running a lot, which is something I don't do at all anymore. I mean, running specifically, but I was running like 3 miles a night, 4 miles a night. And I had to get up early in the morning to work at a sandwich shop, you may recall. But I had been out running at night, and I point this out because I distinctly remember how still it was. By this point, late spring, it's mid-May, so late spring. It was still. It was a nice night for running, but no breeze. I distinctly remember that because where we live, it is often gray, windy, and raining, and it was none of these things.
It's even like tonight. There's almost no wind out there tonight even. It's very still. Yeah.
Often that we have that. There's always some sort of breeze.
It is noticeable for sure. Yeah.
So anyhow, I go home. It's late at night, probably like 11. And I'm sleeping in the basement, and a couple hours later, I'm woken up by Corey, who had the Eddie Bauer edition Explorer. And of course, Brandon, who had been there when I tossed my cookies outside the Eddie Bauer Explorer because I got myself so worked up. And then our other friend, Art, was there. They had gone out there in the middle of the night, and they didn't even, I think they probably didn't even bother to ask me, because Art Corey and Brandon remember how I had reacted about going there in the middle of the night.
Yeah, yeah.
But they had gone out there in the middle of the night because, we were just drawn to the place. Again, Corey had seen it on TV. They said it was just the craziest place they'd ever been to. So they wanted to take photos. They wanted to do all the things that people are still doing uh, with all these ghost shows. We talked about the rules and whatnot, but they get to the cemetery. They leave the windows down the Explorer. They put the headlights on and they go into the cemetery. There's that big sandstone wall around it, which sits about chest high, maybe a little up between chest and waist. And they can't see anything because the headlights are cutting across. So everything below the wall is just black. And Art bumps something and it falls over. So Brandon lights his lighter and he sees, oh, you've knocked over a tombstone. Now,
Yikes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yikes.
And that's when the wind started picking up, like in a big way. And they heard something coming down the hill. No joke. And I believe them. I believe them because...
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
And these three guys have been out in the woods. Like, they are not hunters. Like, I mean, you and I are out often fishing in the woods or sometimes hunting, But they grew up playing in the woods and they know what deer sound like and they know how deer respond and everything. And this is coming down the hill. They run and leap over the sandstone wall and into the Explorer, and they drive off. And they drive straight to my house, and they all run into the basement, falling over one another. And this is even after like the 10-15 minute drive to get to my house. And they tell me this story. And when they started talking about how the wind picked up, as soon as they realized what Art had done accidentally, all I could think about was how still the night had been
previously. Yeah.
It shook them all up. It really did. And it was, I guess it was, you hear a place is haunted, you hear strange things happen, and you either are fascinated by the reality of it or you're fascinated because you know there is a better explanation than something paranormal, but you go there, you're drawn there, and then you get that satisfaction of something crazy happening. And none of us could explain it. We thought, well, maybe it was a deer. Well, yeah, maybe, but coincidence, the wind, the sound, it didn't sound like a deer to them. Deer usually don't run towards people. They said it sounded like big dogs or a bear, and that's possible, but what type of bears do we have around here, and how do they react, Brendan?
Yeah, the black bear. We have black bears around here, and they leave quickly.
Right.
Yeah. They want no part to do with you. Yeah.
Right. If you have a terrier, they will run from a terrier routinely. They are not. Yeah. So of course, in the legends, there's all these. This guy. From the founder of the Y Cemetery, the patriarch of the Y clan, the one who came over from Switzerland. Of course, he's a trapper. He's a big hunter. He has hunting dogs. And a lot of the myths about the cemetery talk about either red eyes that follow you down the road or specifically the hunting dogs. And so it was just a very weird thing. And I don't believe, but I believe them, and I remember how I reacted, and I remember how the temperature thing in the Explorer was, and it was just a very bizarre sequence of events. And just my final thoughts were like, it was just a lot of weird stuff. I don't know how to explain it, but if there were any rules to the ghost thing about a cemetery being haunted, this would meet them, because again, it was on the old farmland. It's just one family there. And it's still a very famous place to this day. I have never seen the program that featured it. I don't even know what program did. I looked for a while and had no luck finding it. So that's kind of my story for the evening. It's a bit personal one. And of course, that night when the tombstone was knocked over, I wasn't there, but within 20 minutes, at very most of it happening, I was being told it by all the people that were there. And of course, they went back the next morning and propped the stone back up, and it's been since repaired because the place has again been vandalized a few times. But Brendan, I don't know if you have any stories of it. I don't know what you make of all that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I've heard bits and pieces of that story from you and those guys over the years. Like I could definitely say that those guys were shook up, because I think I heard that story the first time the next day, I think, because everyone was still around and still kind of hyped up over it. Now, I think that a few things kind of go into that. Like you mentioned, there is like expectations. When we think a place is haunted, that obviously primes you for that experience, and it primes your interpretations. You're obviously going to be less logical and less discerning with what might be happening around you. Then again, you go there at night, it's even creepier. You stack those things on top, and you're ready to have that kind of reaction. That's kind of why you're going in the first place. But like you said, I think a lot of us go to those places with different intentions too. We are interested in the history, and part of that history tends to be the folklore around some of is this place haunted? So they're not mutually exclusive in that sense. They're very often tied together. Now, I know I have been there 2 or 3 times, all times during the day. Were me and you ever there together? I don't think so.
I thought we had been.
Maybe
once
we have.
We took my wife there.
Oh, you know what? You're right. Okay, that was quite a while ago.
And she's only been there twice, because another time I took a lady I worked with, and both my wife, my daughter, and I went and took her there, because it is difficult to find if you're not familiar.
Yeah, if you don't know where you're going, it's not easy to end up there. Now, the few times that I've been there, like I said, all during the day. Once or twice was definitely before it had been not like remodeled, but like fixed up considerably. And then once has been since they like redid the gate, fixed a lot of the gravestones, fixed some of the stuff on the wall, and kind of like clean the area up a little bit. So I've seen it in those two forms, and I think those are very two different places now. When you have a cemetery, regardless of whether it is a family plot or not, that is overgrown and unkempt, again, if there is any clout to spirits wanting to like rest, but also like be remembered and honored in any way, an unkempt cemetery would have to be something that spirits don't like, you'd think, because it shows they're not being remembered, they're not being thought of very highly, they're not being respected as people. So if the place is really kind of run down, you have folks there coming there just to like screw around or disturb them, then if I'm a spirit, I might be a little pissed off too. But then on the other hand, once it's been cleaned up, if you have people coming there for more of the history and the folklore, it probably has a much better vibe to it, and you'd think spirits would be a little more at rest. Now, that being said, the first time or two that I was there, I do specifically remember there being candles on a number of the the 4 like cardinal corners in the cemetery. So obviously someone was performing some sort of rituals there. Who knows what the intentions were? I don't like to presume to know one way or the other. They could have been good, could have been not good. It's impossible to tell.
They could have been making it up as they went along.
Totally, yeah, exactly.
Often the case.
Yeah, which is possible. Which is possible too. It was being used by people, but not being kept up by people, and I think that's very different. So, I mean, those guys going there and hearing something coming down through the woods towards them. As someone who does, like we've said before, spends a lot of time in the woods, it is shocking how much noise a squirrel could make in dry leaves. You know,
Good point. And this
it,
is May, so there's
yeah. So
there's
probably, yeah,
new
probably,
growth, but
but that
our
being
forest
said,
floors are littered with leaves and branches.
yeah, this is definitely not the juniper forests out west or anything. When you hear something that sounds big coming down a hill towards you at night, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to tell you to leave every time, because you don't know what it is. It's an unknown threat. Whether it's real or not, you don't want to be there for it. So like, you can't blame those guys for that kind of reaction. At that point, it's like, I don't care what the vibe is around here. I don't care how spooky or how peaceful it is. I should take cover. The fact that all three of them heard that definitely, I think, adds some validity to the fact that something happened. Whether or not it's paranormal or not, who knows?
Well, and that's the thing that got me. All three of them reacted in a very similar way. And these, like, these were big guys. These were fit guys. And, these were not people who were afraid of confrontation.
Yeah.
And I know that because I've watched some pretty crazy things happen with them. And
right, exactly.
It's hysterical to me, but it's definitely, if they thought it was a person messing with them, they would have messed right back.
It would have been, that's exactly.
They would have stood there and waited.
Exactly. If any of them thought it was someone screwing with them, that would have ended very, very differently, for everybody involved.
100%. So here's a couple questions for you too, though, along this topic. And first off, here's a more general one, but I think we can agree it's a strange place. I've never really been able to fully reconcile my feelings and history with the place with my kind of larger worldview. I've never been able to really make peace with those experiences. There's only one other experience not related to Y Cemetery that I ever had that, again, I don't think about it a lot, and I talk about it even less because I just haven't been able to square it.
Mm-hmm.
But my question, again, is more general. When it comes to a place having a reputation for being haunted or for cryptid activity, and it becomes almost not a tourist spot, but it is frequented, do you think the frequency of people going to a place diminishes the creepy vibe and value?
I think that the amount of people coming to a place can be a good thing or it can be a negative thing. I think, like many things, it all comes to intent. If people are coming there wanting to be scared, being primed to be scared, assuming that the stories they hear about the inhabitants of this graveyard being threatening and negative and chasing people out and everything, then you're going to be naturally more defensive. A defensive posture. When you meet somebody for the first time and they're being really defensive, your natural reaction is to be defensive as well. So I think that the environment can react to that over time. Does that kind of track with what
that's what you're saying makes sense to me from where you're at. But I guess my question was more like, if a place is supposed to be scary, but like tons of people come out here and they check it out, does that make it less scary to you?
I would say personally, no, it doesn't. I would say there are lots of places that I'm sure live up to the hype, we'll say. I'm sure those places are out there. Like Gettysburg would be one of them. For as overdone as Gettysburg is being haunted, every time I go there, I hear or see something that creeps me out, every time. That being said, that's a very complex location. I think places like that are the exception more than the rule. I would say usually if I go somewhere that has a reputation for being creepy or being haunted, that's usually when I'm putting my hopeful skeptic hat on a little bit tighter, trying to come in even more even keel, if you will. Because I think a lot of times, like with a place like this, if it has a bad reputation, I feel like it's probably more a result of the people coming there than whatever the environment already is.
Well, I would definitely say that with the recent vandalisms that have occurred there, I think that's definitely a negative connotation because
Absolutely.
I'm more afraid to go out to the place because so many people go out there knowing that some of the people who have gone out there have done things like that. Those probably aren't people that I want to be around. Just
Absolutely.
because even if it's just not being even if it's not limited to their being disrespectful to the property, how are they going to treat you out there? Like, but since you brought up
Yeah.
Gettysburg, here's a question I've wanted to ask for a while, and I've just never got a good time to do it. I'm sure you've heard multiple stories of people, they open the door and all of a sudden they're looking into like a impromptu Civil War hospital, essentially, and it's like they're looking through a window into time, but somebody sees them and they like get out of there. I've heard stories about people exiting in the elevator at Gettysburg College and that happening. So how come
I love time
we've
slips.
never
Yeah.
we don't hear more stories of people all of a sudden they looked in their doorway and there was somebody dressed in futuristic clothing and they couldn't figure out what they were doing there? How come we don't hear stories like that?
That's no excellent question. Excellent question. And just to kind of set the stage for how I'm going to answer that, I think there are two types of phenomena. There are two major buckets in this phenomena. I would say there are time slips where someone is experiencing time in a non-linear way. Time just seems to not operate the way it's supposed to. Now, the lack of forward in time stuff, I think, just complete conjecture, either has one or two major answers. One, it's because time doesn't work that way and the future has not been set. So you can't look forward in time.
But
Correct.
Real quick.
Yep. No, please. Yeah. Do.
When these things happen and people say they looked at me, they motioned to me or something like that, that's just the classic, they don't know they're dead. Then again, I go back to, we should therefore be getting at least an equal amount of stories where we are looked in upon by someone clearly not of our time, but not of a time that we've known historically.
Yes. So what you're saying is, like, let's say hypothetically that UFOs are actually just little consciousness bubbles from like the future.
That might be the answer right there then. If UFOs are just the future looking in on us.
Well, I mean, that's again with a lot of like really crazy UFO stuff. A way to answer this is, it's kind of a bullshit way of getting around some of these things, but people say, oh, well, how come it defies the laws of physics? It's like, well, it's because it's just a mode of consciousness. It's not an actual craft. That's why it defies physics, because it's not beholden to physics. So it's possible that stuff that far in advance is looking in on us already, and that's just the method in which it happens. It's not happening through hotel doors or elevator doors. But you're right, it is curious that there's nothing 50 years in the future, it's not happening that way. Or maybe if those stories are out there, maybe we just don't hear them as much for one reason or another, because people don't know how to articulate what they're seeing. Or maybe
it's good. It's a lot easier to describe something that you have some familiarity with, even if it's just through old paintings or whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. At least there's some, like, you can basically pick an era and I can at least describe something about it,
Right.
But if someone says, what's the world going to look like in 150 years, like, yeah, we can speculate, but
we have no real concrete
So I think it would be more than likely, because how there's a joke about, like, in 200 years when someone describes how we use cars, it's going to sound insane. Like the fact that we build these contraptions that have internal combustion engines and we drive them 80 miles an hour and everyone dies, but we just keep doing it anyway,
right.
Like it's gonna sound insane to someone who's like, well, who's used to teleporting, or whatever. It's
Sure,
possible to.
it'll sound as crazy as I know. Like 120 years ago, there was a collar in for a men's collar before most shirts had attached collars. It was colloquially known in parts of Europe as the uncle killer because it had a tendency to strangle guys. It was
Yeah,
one of these
and
famous high
yeah.
attachable collars around 1890 to 1900, I want to say. But yeah,
So it's possible that the reason we don't see stuff in the future is either A, because it doesn't work that, it just straight up doesn't work that way, or B, maybe it's because people aren't able to articulate it to the point where telling the stories isn't as common. Those are that's my two answers.
well, and here's the last thing
Excellent
I wanted to
question.
talk.
Excellent
Thank
question.
you. It's been bugging me for some time, and like I said, I
Yeah.
haven't found a good place to shoehorn that in until now. So my last kind of thought was thinking about why cemetery and why it has become the cemetery in the greater region, folklore related. Now, if you go south to Pittsburgh, there's another similar cemetery tale. We will certainly talk about at some point. I'm sure you're familiar with Blue Mist, of which there's really kind of a couple very different stories, honestly. But why cemetery? And let me expand upon that. I'm looking at it now strictly as the folklore aspect.
Mm-hmm.
We have this cemetery that's kind of way off the beaten path. I mean, there are some private homes within a mile or two of it,
Yeah.
but beyond that, the houses are pretty few and far between, and yet it's gotten all this attention. Yet there is a series of mass graves outside between two
Oh
big
yeah.
towns in our
Yep.
region known as the Black Cross.
Yep. I've been
Now,
there. Yep.
as have I. Now, it had kind of been nearly forgotten about, but it had made the rumor mills. I mean, I had heard about it before the historical plaque had been put up. A
Mm-hmm.
historic plaque was put up, I think, around 2004, 2005,
Yeah.
marking where it's at. And I think we've been there together even, but
Mm-hmm.
neither one of these cemeteries was really widely known outside of word of mouth. How come we don't see a lot of legend tripping at the Black Cross, but yet why cemetery we do? Because again, if this is just based on the folklore aspect
Mm-hmm.
alone, I would have pinpointed the Black Cross to be the place because everything else considered, I mean, they're both off the beaten path a little bit, but one's not too far off a pretty big highway between two sizable towns.
Mm-hmm.
And the story around the Black Cross is, well, the Spanish flu epidemic. I know because we're recording this in the time of COVID still, we've reflected on that quite a bit. And the reports are as many as 20 people to a grave. Basically, a lot of the first generation people that had moved to these two towns, Katanning and Butler, so many people were dying. Where do we put all these people? Well, we're going to put these ones in this mass grave in between these two towns, pretty much. As many as 20 to a grave is what I've heard reported. They took creosoted train rails the cross beams for not the tracks themselves, but the wood timbers, and they put up a cross built of those on the site, and that stood for some time. That's the story of the Black Cross. So again, based on that story, I would figure that the legends and these ghost stories would be the place for it. Not so much why cemetery, which is a fairly small family plot. Its ominous feeling comes from the fact that it's got this dark sandstone wall and the two obelisks.
Yeah, so as far as why, I think it's purely a logistical question, because I know of a number of family cemeteries in the area that both of us and a few other of my friends have been to and found and checked out and everything, that are not easy to get to. Some of them are on state land where you have to do a little bit of hiking. And some of them are kept up, some of them aren't kept up. Whereas this particular cemetery is easy to get to. And not only is it easy to get to, but once you're there, it is very stereotypically creepy. Like you said, with the black sandstone, it's just far enough from other houses. You're probably not going to bother anybody, but I think it's still possible to hear residual noise from those houses to aid in, people hearing things. The road is just traveled enough that you're probably going to be worried someone's going to come up on you, but not traveled enough that it actually happens very often. It's between a bunch of these towns, like you said, all of which have plenty of high school students, which is it's just a prime location. I think it's just a prime location because you're right. Like,
high school students really are fodder for legend tripping.
They are. Yeah. I mean, that's something. I mean, like that's something I really miss about high schools. We used to do a lot more of that, and we still do. But again, like you were saying earlier, now it's much more academically tied, which is still a lot of fun because you're right. The Black Cross, like I said, I've been there twice, and both times I did not like it.
Yeah,
it feels completely different. I feel that also, like I said, but there's just the woods there now.
Well, like, and that's one of the things that kind of creeps me out more. My feelings, I remember at the time being there. The last time I was there, I was standing, and there's a little trail that leads to.
It is a small trail.
Cross, right? Yeah,
it's a small trail. Yeah.
There's something about a cemetery is an intentional place. Yes, there are bodies in the ground below you, but they're in these boxes, and it's an intentional place. And I know a lot of people that have a lot of qualms about walking over where the bodies actually are. They walk by the footstones, or they walk behind the headstones and peer around. There's a lot of superstition around that. With the Black Cross, you don't know where they are, and it seems less intentional because now there's just roots of trees growing through people, and it seems like the ground is just shifting in a way that it doesn't in a manicured cemetery.
And I think that it's much more palpably tragic too, because it's cemeteries. You're like, okay, this is, I mean, obviously people can still die tragically and untimely, but there's something, it's a bookend, you're like, okay, this is where, I mean, obviously people can get cremated and stuff like that, but for the most part, it's like, okay, this cemetery from a romantic standpoint is like prescribed endpoint for normal society, kind of thing.
Right.
It's like you're born in the hospital, you do stuff, and you end up here. And it's very intentional. This is how things are supposed to be. With something like the Black Cross in a mass grave, you're right. I think this gets back to what I said earlier about intention. The intention of that location was born out of tragedy, fear, and necessity, which completely changes the vibe of it and makes it a much spookier place. Now, I'm not saying that the souls there are any less deserving of peace, obviously, but I think the reason, like I said, I'm going to kind of walk back what I said earlier about this being a purely logistical answer. I think people are much more willing to go to even a creepy cemetery because it is still a cemetery. It is just one step removed from our normal narrative. It doesn't break from that story, whereas something like the Black Cross Cemetery is something that is interrupting. It seems less natural. It's a reaction, not a plan.
I can't think of mass graves and not think of things like the killing fields of Cambodia. It's just a very different thing. I think our fear of cemeteries doesn't follow the rules that people have given to ghosts and hauntings. Case in point, the very first thing I asked you this evening was, do you believe that cemeteries are haunted? And you gave a very good series of reasons, which would, again, are in line with those rules. I think some of the fears of cemeteries are more about our fears and our reservations about joining the numbers. But that was my series of stories for the evening. And again, this is a personal one. Like I said, I've had a couple experiences in life that, I've made it very clear where I stand. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but not I don't believe in a lot of these things, but this series of incidents surrounding this cemetery I've never been able to fully square, and part of that might just be because I'm so close to it. If somebody else told me this story, I would look for justifications. And there's something about the feeling that you get. So much of what you said about your experience at the Black Cross and at Y Cemetery has been based on just the general feeling you get from the atmosphere. But that's it for this evening. I want to thank you for sitting down and talking to me. I want to thank everybody who's sitting down and listening to us. I know before we started this evening, Brendan and I were looking over, there's been some really nice comments and reviews that we've received. We have not been very good about looking at those, and we are still very new at this, but really do want to thank everybody that's had some kind words. And if you're enjoying this, we definitely want to hear from you. You can definitely email us, leave us a review, let us know what you think, and we will try to be better at thanking you all for doing as much.